Testing. Testing one. It is my great joy to welcome you to our 2023 public lecture here at St Bart's. My name is Adam Lowe. I'm one of the team members here at St Bart's, and we really do count it as the greatest honour to welcome you to meet here and to really open up such an important topic, such a really critical question. Does Australia have a religious freedom problem? So tonight we're going to hear from our wonderful guest, Dr. Mike Bird, and in a moment I'll welcome him up. And then after the talk, there'll be time for a Q&A, which I'll explain how that's going to work just in a moment. But as you gather here tonight, I just want to point out a few practical things. It would be really helpful to have mobile phones on silent, so if that's possible, please do that. And also, if there is an emergency and we need to evacuate the building, then there are exits either side, or you can exit via the back of the auditorium doors from which you entered. But we will let you know if that is the case. Tonight, you are really welcome, and we want to encourage you to submit your questions. So tonight is really opening up a conversation, and we really count that as the greatest privilege. And that includes those who are joining us online tonight as well. A big welcome to all those joining us online. The most simplest way to submit your questions will be really following the link that will appear on the screen. You can just go to sli.do/Mike Bird, and you can submit your questions there. Or if you see a question that's really similar to yours or the exact question that you have, you can just upvote that. You can vote that. And that way, we'll get a real sense of what are the common questions and what are perhaps the more unique questions, and then we will try to get through as many of those as possible. We will have microphones roaming as well for anyone who can't submit questions that way, but I really would encourage you to do that if you can. It is really such a privilege to welcome the Reverend Dr. Mike Bird tonight, and I'd love to invite you to really welcome him warmly. As I said, it really is such a privilege to welcome you tonight, and we are so thankful for your generosity in sharing with us, coming and opening up this question for us, and really being such a catalyst to help us be considered in this topic and to spark conversation. So thank you so much. Thought it would also be great if we get to know you a little bit as well. Not everyone knows you, so you might get to meet people for the very first time tonight, I'm sure, afterwards with some hot chocolate or tea. Mike doesn't drink coffee, so don't offer him coffee though, that's okay. But Mike is the Academic Dean at Ridley College in Melbourne, and he also is a Substacker, is it right? So a blogger, and a prolific author. Now, I don't actually know what the definition for prolific is, but you have authored over 30 books?
Yeah.
And I think that must be in the ballpark of prolific. On a whole range of topics, actually, and I'll share a little bit about some of those later on after the talk and the Q&A, but you've also particularly written on this whole topic of religious freedom that you're opening up for us this evening. You might just share with us, though, so you're academic dean, but where do you spend your time during the week? Where are the spaces where you often are?
Well, thanks. First of all, say thanks for having me. Thanks, Adam. Thank you to St Bart's. It's a pleasure to be here. I always love coming to Toowoomba. As for what I do during the week, I spend a lot of time at Ridley College, where I obviously teach New Testament theology, train people for Christian faith, for Christian mission in a complex and changing world. Spend a lot of time with my family, my wife Naomi, and I've got my two boys here, Marcus and Theo. A little bit of tennis when I can fit it in. I like to hit a bit of a topspin forehand when I can. And yeah, that's pretty much how I spend my week. That and a ridiculous number of hours on the Eastern Freeway in Melbourne.
We don't quite have as many traffic jams here in Toowoomba. So as I said, you have authored over 30 books, and I just wonder, how do you choose what you're going to write on?
Oh, well, it comes down to a variety of things. Sometimes it may be a need I perceive. Like I was teaching theology, and I thought, it'd be really good if we had a textbook that made the gospel the centre boundary and integrating theme for theology. And I couldn't find one that does it that way, so I thought, well, I guess I'll have to write one myself then. Or it's another topic like, there's debates about religious freedom, secularism, that sort of thing, and I start reading into it and kind of get hooked and excited about what I'm seeing and realizing that we have not just a religious literacy problem, we have a secular literacy problem. So I think, it'd be good to make a contribution to this area. That's pretty much how it happens.
Huh. So thinking particularly on the topic of religious freedom that you're speaking about tonight, was there any particular catalyst that really caused you to write the book that you have written on that?
Yeah, it was. Back in 2016, the Catholic Archbishop Julian Porteous produced a document explaining the Catholic Church's views on family and marriage. This was, when we're about to have the plebiscite on same-sex marriage. And he was basically explaining the Catholic Church's position. And I read the document. It was very pastoral, it was non-confrontational, and it was designed for all the parents who have children at a Catholic school. And as a result of writing that, a activist made a complaint to the Human Rights Commissioner, and the Human Rights Commissioner said he had a case to answer. And I was a little bit confused by this, because we had a Catholic archbishop who was defending what was then the law of the land, and he was basically being hauled before a tribunal for teaching Catholic beliefs to Catholics. And I thought, that can't be right, surely. I mean, I understand there's LGBT rights and there's religious freedom and there's a bit of argy-bargy there, but this can't be right. So, what does our Constitution say about religious freedom? What does it say in the various laws about discrimination and the states? And I just kind of went down the rabbit hole, and I'm still down there with a whole bunch of lawyers and political theologians and international law and religious freedom, and what are our Muslim friends thinking about this topic. So yeah, I'm still down the rabbit hole, and this is kind of me just throwing up a note saying this is what I've found so far in the rabbit hole.
Well, Mike, we're looking forward to going down the rabbit hole with you tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, you say that now.
Yeah,
you say
right.
that now.
But thank you so much. Would you like once again to give Mike a really warm welcome?
Oh, good Queensland water. It's good. No, I've been in Babylon / Victoria for too long. I am by upbringing a Queenslander, and it's difficult because in Victoria, state of origin is such a non-event. So when I'm at work bouncing on joy on a Thursday morning, and I say, state of origin, Queensland won. It's like a football midweek. So it's good to be amongst my people up here in Toowoomba. Well, the topic I'm dealing with is that of religious freedom. Now, as you'll probably become abundantly clear, I'm not a lawyer. I did apply to go to law school, but I was rejected for medical grounds. They were unable to extract my conscience. I'm joking. Any lawyers? I'm joking. Lawyers are an important part of our society. So I'm got into this topic of religious freedom, looking at various things that are happening in our culture in the last, 7 or 8 years, where this topic is really ramped up as of one that people have very strong feelings about, both for and against. And I've heard people say things like, with all these mask mandates in churches, it's like we're living in North Korea. It's horrible. And then I hear other people saying, Scott Morrison is part of a secret plan hatched by Hillsong to take over the Australian government. All sorts of weird stuff like that. We can't have Christians as Prime Minister. It's a weird time. Initially, very quickly, part of the church's faith and witness in the Greco-Roman world, where they went from being a minority sect within Judaism to becoming a major religious force in the Greco-Roman world, the church was largely persecuted. Not always like top down, but locally and spasmodically, different Christian groups could be persecuted in North Africa, in Italy, France, and around the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's why they were very quickly stern advocates for religious freedom. In fact, in the early 3rd century, one church father, Tertullian, who was a Christian lawyer, he wrote this on this religious freedom. He said, "We are worshippers of one God, whose existence and character nature teaches all men, at whose lightning and thunder you tremble, whose benefits minister to your happiness. You think that others too are gods whom we know to be devils. However, it is a fundamental human right, a privilege of nature, that every person should worship according to his own convictions. One man's religion neither harms nor helps another man. It is surely no part of religion to compel religion, to which free will and not force should lead us, the sacrificial victims being required of a willing mind. You will render no real service to your gods by compelling us to sacrifice. For they can have no desire of offerings from the unwilling, unless they are animated by a spirit of contention, which is a thing altogether undivine." Tertullian is writing at a time where people in the Roman Empire are saying Christians are a threat to the social fabric. They refuse to worship the traditional gods. They're effectively atheists, if you like. And by refusing to do that, but to participate in the festivals, to offer a pinch of incense to the emperor, they are not only blasphemous, they are treasonous. And some considered their very existence to be illegal. So early on, the Christians were very big on this concept of religious freedom. Every person should follow their own conscience in the worship of God. Now, with the conversion of Constantine to Christianity in the 4th century, things and fortunes for Christians began to change quite markedly. It meant the conversion of Constantine meant the end of the persecution of Christians. It also meant religious tolerance across the entire empire, not just for Christians, but for everyone. However, it did lead to the eventual Christianization of the empire, which meant that Christians were no longer merely tolerated, they became privileged and even hegemonic. And when they were hegemonic, how can I put this? Their affection for toleration quickly began to dissipate. And other minority Christian sects could be persecuted, pagan groups could be persecuted, and the Jews were often violently persecuted. Now, I'm not convinced that the conversion of Constantine and the Christianization of the Roman Empire was a bad thing. I think it's simply the success of the Christian mission in the Roman world. But it did thereafter lead to a very complicated relationship between the Christian church and political powers, whether we're talking about the Byzantine East or we're talking about the Latin West. And in the Latin West, there could be a lot of conflicts or different arrangements between the church and the state. Sometimes the church acted as just merely chaplains of the state, a department of the state. In other times, bishops and popes attempted to carve out their own kind of state within a state. And then on other occasions, again, there was a lot of hostility between various kings, princes, and rulers and the churches. That came to a head in the 11th century, where the church, feeling that it was too indented, too cozy with the political powers of the day, began a process of reform, seeking to have a higher level of spirituality, of holiness than would be found in the halls of power. And this is called a period of reformatio, where there was a deliberate introduction of some degree of insulation between popes and princes of the Middle Ages. But even then, there was still a lot of problems. Still, corruption abounded in certain wings of the church, and that's why we had in the 16th century the Protestant Reformation, where you get people like Martin Luther trying to use the Bible to critique the traditions, the trappings of the medieval church, saying our allegiance is not to the Pope, not to the council, not to the philosophers of the age. Our allegiance, our faith should be in instead the God of the Bible. But that created a rupture in Western Christendom, as it was now divided between Catholic states and Protestant states. And out of that rupture, if you like, even Anglicanism was born. And we had all sorts of tumults and conflicts, quite notoriously the 30 Years' War. It became very quickly apparent that no one side, Protestant or Catholic, was going to dominate. So there needed to be some kind of arrangement, because this hostility between different Christian groups could not keep going perpetually. And they basically, out of that conflict, developed the earlier stages of secularism. That monarchs, governments would permit a degree of religious diversity in their population, whether Protestant or Catholic. They would be allowed to worship in their own way, in their own churches, without government interference, without government coercion, irrespective of where they were. And that is the groundwork for what became secularism. And it's not long after this sort of introduction of secularism into Europe that we have the Enlightenment. Martin Luther's skepticism towards church authority gave license to the skepticism towards the very idea of religious authority itself. So we see a whole critique of the idea of revealed religion. And this is where you get the age of inquiry, the age of reason. And many people begin to either abandon the Christian faith or try to reinterpret the faith within this new mindset, this new era that is modernity. And this is where you get people who become Unitarians, deists, agnostics, or atheists, if you like. And it is out of this very complex post-Reformation world that the American Republic was created. America, as a series of European colonies, was founded in part by different European powers, the Spanish, the French, and the English, all taking parts of the eastern United States. And it was definitely a place pregnant with religious energy for the Puritans who went there. They wanted to get away from what they saw as the corrupt establishment of the Church of England and establish like a new Jerusalem, where they would have a purer, more simple religion, a better way of living out their Christian faith, far away from the menacing gaze of European monarchs and tyrants. Which is why at the founding of the American Republic, amongst its first amendments, there was a very strong advocacy for the separation of church and state. They did not want to be like the churches of Europe that would be officially Protestant or Catholic with mere toleration for dissenters. They wanted to see the two bodies completely separated from one another. This is why the First Amendment in the US Constitution says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So Congress is not going to give hegemonic or privileged status to one particular religion, whether that's Presbyterians, Baptists, or Episcopalians, nor shall they interfere with how people do religion. This is a further acceleration of the idea of secularism. There are some places where religion is not allowed to matter, and where religion does matter, it is meant to be immune from government interference. And as it turns out, this type of secularism was a great model for multicultural, for political pluralism. Because if you not just only tolerate Protestants and Catholics, you now have the same tools, the same framework where you can tolerate Jews, Muslims, people of all faith and none. Thus, secularism was initially created as a way of creating space for people of all faiths and none. It was a means for enabling peace and participation and living with differences. And Australia was founded in a similar context. I would argue, and I will argue, that the Australian Constitution is largely a British appropriation of the American system. In our own context, we have a similar separation of church and state. We have a similar clause claiming that the government will not interfere in people's religious activities. Nonetheless, there are some complicating and concerning factors when it comes to secularism. If there is a wall of separation between church and state, can you have a gate that rides between them? You know, for example, we have chaplains in the Australian military that are funded. We have a certain degree of government funding even in faith-based schools. We have chaplains in hospitals. I believe it's still so at the moment that the Australian Parliament begins by reciting the Lord's Prayer. So secularism can be a little bit fuzzy around the edges. And in our more recent context, I think there are a number of challenges to secularism, because secularism can either be benign, you know, and champion the ideal of, you know, being a safe place for people of all faith and none, but there are ways of being secular that can be a little bit more militant and a little bit more punitive towards people of faith. Let me give a couple of examples. I think there are some challenges from a more militant secularism. Some weeks ago, in the ACT territorial government rushed through laws so they could seize Calvary Hospital. Calvary Hospital is a Catholic hospital that was founded in the 1970s. The Little Sisters of, I think they're called the Little Sisters of Mercy, were invited to create this hospital at the invitation of the ACT government. Some months earlier, the ACT government noted this hospital was problematic because they refused to provide a full range of services related to reproductive health and engage in end-of-life care, including euthanasia. Not long after that, they rushed through legislation to seize the hospital and bring it under direct government control. And I remember seeing quite vividly, on a Sunday, they sent out a construction crew. One of the first things they did was remove the cross from Calvary Hospital. I think doing that on a Sunday was quite deliberate. It was meant to be quite symbolic. And it was reminiscent of similar things I've seen in places like the Soviet Union and China. I have no doubt in my mind that that was a punitive action. It was the attempt to take measures against a Catholic hospital because it would not commit themselves to certain services that the ACT government believed were important. We could give a whole bunch of other examples of similar things. I would say in Australia we don't experience religious persecution. Let me be very clear. I read magazines like Voice of the Martyrs. I have a working knowledge of different places around the world where there is real persecution of Christians. What we face in Australia is, and this has been officially documented in the Pew Research survey, we do have high rates of social hostility towards religion, not government persecution of religion, but high rates of social hostility towards religion. Australia does have unhealthy amounts of Islamophobia. We do have some unhealthy amounts of anti-Semitism. I remember some years ago, Green Senate leader Adam Band tweeted out an image that was an anti-Semitic trope depicting Jews as a hooked-nosed banker. It was quickly taken down, but it didn't really get reported much in the media. We also have, I believe, high rates of anti-Catholicism as well, and that is a point of concern. The third problem we have is a gap in the Australian Constitution. This is what section 116 of the Australian Constitution says. It says, "The Commonwealth shall not make any law for establishing any religion, or for imposing any religious observance, or for prohibiting the free exercise of any religion, and no religious test shall be required as a qualification for any office or public trust under the Commonwealth." Now, what you have to note there is that this only applies to the Commonwealth government. The states themselves are free to pursue their own arrangement with religious bodies in their own specific jurisdictions. Now, there have been two attempts in 1952 and in 1988 under Bob Hawke to change the Constitution so these religious freedom protections would apply not only to the Commonwealth but also to the states. Both times, for a variety of reasons, they have been defeated. Now that itself means there is a genuine lacuna, there is a gap in our religious freedom protections. So how have the states gone about filling in their gap? What they have largely done to fill in the gap is given religious bodies exemptions to anti-discrimination legislation. Now, that itself is incredibly problematic because I would argue religious freedom is far more than the right to discriminate on isolated incidents. Secondly, there's also the risk that these exemptions to anti-discrimination law can be wrongly used and deployed. They can be weaponized against different groups, people based on gender, sexual orientation, or even based on their religious observance or lack thereof. And we don't have anything really else, and it's even more acute given that those exemptions to anti-discrimination law are often being rolled back, and there's nothing there to really replace it with. So we do have a genuine, if you like, a gap in our religious freedom frameworks. Fourth, and this is somewhat the epicenter of the current context, there are some very real differences between how we balance LGBTIQ rights and religious freedom. So generally, I think we would argue that a non-discrimination principle is a genuinely good thing. People have the right to live out their life without facing harassment or discrimination. But then how do faith-based schools maintain the identity of their institution if they are not allowed to discriminate in their hiring practices or discern who are the best students to attend their school or their charity or whatever business they are engaged in? I mean, that's a real thing. Most school principals I've spoken to at Christian schools have told me they do not expel students for being gay. I would say that is a good thing. But on the other hand, would it be right to force a Muslim school to hire a gay atheist as their vice principal? That's probably not going to work out well in the long run. But what are the limits and where do we put them? Where do we give different institutions the ability to maintain their identity and ethos at the same time upholding a genuine non-discrimination principle as a good thing? That's what we're trying to work out in the moment, and coming to some kind of equitable solution is proving to be very, very difficult. A fifth problem I think we're facing is we're living in an age of post-liberal views of freedom. You know, once upon a time, it was common to say things like, I disagree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. I don't think that's generally the law of the land now. It's more of the case, I don't like what you say, and I want to see you cancelled. We believe of freedom of speech for our tribe, whether that's conservative or progressive. We want freedom of speech for us, but we want censorship for everyone else. That's not a genuinely good principle. Let me give you a really good example of that. I've got a number of progressive friends who are not very big fans of Israel Folau, for reasons you can imagine. If you don't know, Israel Folau was an Australian rugby player who put on social media some comments about gay people going to hell. I don't think what he wrote was particularly helpful or particularly pastoral, but that's another story. But as a result of putting it out there, he was eventually sacked, or he had to come to a arrangement with Rugby Australia. Now, a lot of my progressive friends I speak to think, now this was good. He should have been sacked. They should have got rid of him for saying that. It was offensive. He did not have the right to say that. He should experience some degree of punishment for what he said. When that happens, I tell them the story of Brian Leach. Brian Leach was a 50-year-old grandfather who worked for supermarket chain Asda in the United Kingdom. He was on Facebook one day and he reposted a Billy Connolly skit or rant where he was saying many expletive things about all the religions of the world. He was certainly not a fan of any of them, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Buddhist, or Hindu. And he kind of, reposted this anti-religious rant by Billy Connolly. One of his colleagues at ASDA made a complaint about Brian Leach to the ASDA management. ASDA management confronted Brian Leach over this, and he was told he had to apologise, which he duly did. And then, after he apologised, he was still sacked by ASDA. And what I like to ask people, if you believe that Rugby Australia can sack Israel Folau for what he said, you also have to accept that ASDA was within the right for sacking Brian Leach. And so I asked them, which one of these do you want to affirm? And my friends often go along with, well, I'm happy to see both sacked as long as we can get rid of Israel Folau, or something like that. Which strikes me a kind of, we've got to burn the village to save the village kind of a mentality. But like I said, the idea that we need to empower employers to police our own social media activity and take punitive actions against people for what they say, I think sets the labour movement backwards 30 years. Why on earth would anyone who supports the working class or working people believe employers can sack you based on exercising your own political or religious views on social media? So it's this post-liberal age that I think we are struggling with. So given what I've just said, given that Australia does have a little bit of social hostility towards religion, given the gaps in our constitution, given the fact that defining religious freedom or defending it with exemptions to anti-discrimination laws I don't think is wise or workable, and conflicts with LGBT rights, post-liberal views of freedom, what is the solution? Well, I want to argue that the problem is not secularism. Secularism is, in fact, the solution. I believe secularism is a good thing. Secularism, at its best, is about creating space for people of all faiths and none. Defined that way, secularism is a good thing. Because, not in the sort of circles I travel in, we often talk about secularism as if it's kind of like the boogeyman. It's kind of like, the secularists are out there trying to get Christians or hurt the church. Secularism is actually one of the best tools we have for articulating, defining, and defending religious freedom. Because secularism basically says this, we don't want to live in a theocracy. We don't want to replace the Governor General with a Pope, Dalai Lama, Ayatollah, or Chief Rabbi. Because when you do that, it always ends badly. It goes badly for the state, and it also goes very badly for the Christian faith, because you end up with a purely civil religion, or a superficial expression of religion. So living in a theocracy does not necessarily lead to better religion. The other side of secularism, as we've seen in our own constitution, is that the government doesn't discriminate you based on your religion, and the government doesn't tell you how to do your religion. So defined that way, secularism is actually the basis, the platform, or the framework in which we can enjoy religious freedom. So what we need is a better secularity. And here's the other thing I need to let you know. There are different types of secularism. There are different secular frameworks around the world. The secularism of North Korea is different to the secularism of France, which is different to the secularism of Turkey or India or Britain or the United Kingdom. For example, consider this. In the United Kingdom, they have an established church with the Church of England. Now, it's not exactly it was the same under King Henry VIII. Things have evolved a little bit since then, thankfully. But the Crown still appoints bishops in the Church of England, albeit through the advice of certain committees and the like. But at the moment, in England, you have a Christian king, you have a Hindu prime minister, a Buddhist home secretary, an atheist opposition leader, and a Muslim mayor of London and Muslim first minister of Scotland. So even with a Christian heritage, an officially established religion, you have a secular, pluralistic, and participationist framework, which I would argue is actually a good thing, because people of all faith and none can participate in the political process. Everyone is enfranchised, there's toleration, and we all contribute to pursuing human flourishing and better goods for our society. So secularism can be pluralistic and it can lead to good outcomes. It doesn't preclude the fact that church and state cannot work together. It's not like the poles of a magnet. You can have church and state bodies working together, but whether that's in education, like I said, chaplains in the military, or different realms. But there's that genuine principle that there are some areas where religion is not allowed to matter, and in religion it is not to be subject to state interference. What Australia really needs, however, is a positive account, a positive bill about religious freedom. You could say what we really need is an anti-religious discrimination bill, but I think we need perhaps something along a Bill of Rights at a federal level which ensures religious freedom. What we need, I would argue, is something along the lines of Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now, this is not a document you have probably heard of. You may not be able to read it because of the fine writing. I'll read it to you. This is what it says, okay? Everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right shall include freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice, and freedom either individually or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. No one shall be subject to coercion which would impair his freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief of his choice. Freedom to manifest one's religions or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. And the states parties to the present covenant shall undertake to have respect for the liberty of parents and, when applicable, legal guardians, to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions. Article 18 of the ICCPR is a very thick, wholesome, and robust definition of religious freedom. This is one we should be articulating and defending. I have to point out the Australian Law Reform Commission recently produced a document attempting to thread the needle and strike a balance in faith-based schools, how they maintain their identity and how they adhere to a non-discrimination principle for LGBTI people. Sadly, that report is largely the attempt to get around the ICCPR, because whenever they mention the ICCPR, Article 18, they normally say but, or however, or like, well, yeah, technically the ICCPR says you've got religious freedom in community with others, but, or yes, technically the ICCPR says parents are entitled to the religious and moral education of their children, but. Which is why I think the Australian Law Reform Commission's report is incredibly problematic, and for a bunch of other reasons I could go into. But you should be familiar with documents like these. These are the things you should be quoting when you write to politicians or civic leaders when it comes to what is an expression of religious freedom that we want to champion. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is one of those such things. Third, what we also need, I believe, is a genuine ethos of what the American legal philosopher John Inazu calls confident pluralism. Okay? The objective of religious freedom is not for religion to be hegemonic, okay, or for us to be privileged or in charge. So if you say, look, I want Australia to be a Christian nation, the issue is, all fine. Which denomination do you want to put in charge? Should we put the Anglicans in charge and we'll force our Baptist friends to baptize their babies? only worship according to the Book of Common Prayer? No, they'll teach them a lesson. No, I mean, that's the problem. If you say, I want Christianity to be hegemonic or to be in charge, well, which version of Christianity gets to be in charge? And you've got the same problems about toleration and religious diversity. What we need is a way of managing differences within diversity, so there are rights and protections for everyone. Confident pluralism is really quite simple. People have the right to be different, to think different, to live different, without fear of reprisal, whether they are gay, God-fearing, or both. Confident pluralism allows genuine differences to coexist without suppressing or minimizing our firmly held convictions. We can embrace pluralism precisely because we are confident in our own beliefs and in the groups and institutions that sustain them. As former Liberal MP Tim Wilson said, a free society does not seek to homogenize belief or conscience, but instead affirms diversity and advocates for tolerance and mutual respect. We need a balance of rights to manage these differences within diversity, which means people have the right to hold unpopular opinions. People have the right to be different without fear of punitive actions from government. People have the right to regard the state as not the ultimate power. People have the right to seek their own happiness to the extent it does not infringe upon the rights of others. And this applies for Anglicans, Buddhists, Baptists, Muslims, people who are gay, bi, trans, or even, dare I say, Collingwood supporters. You can tell I've taken this from a speech I delivered in Victoria. Maybe I should have said the Dolphins these days. Dolphins. Actually, I like the Dolphins. Okay. Let me finish up reading to you a letter that the American President George Washington wrote to a Jewish congregation in Rhode Island. Many Jews had fled Europe, coming to the American colonies, hoping they would not be persecuted by the governing authorities. I mean, many Jews found that they were better treated in the Muslim Ottoman Empire than they were in places like Catholic Spain or even Anglican England. When they wrote to George Washington about his opinion to the Jewish people and whether he'd be leaving them be, this is what he wrote back to them. He said, "It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favourable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in the safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make them afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our own several vocations useful here, and his own due time and way everlastingly happy." Those words, that everyone would sit under their own vine and fig tree and none shall make them afraid, that's drawn from Micah 4:4. And that, I believe, is what we should aspire to. We need to have a species of secularism that becomes a framework to create a safe place for people of all faith and none. We need a religious freedom that is balanced healthily with other rights, including freedom of conscience, freedom of association. And we need to aspire for Australia to be a place where we may all sit under our own vine and fig tree, and none shall make us afraid. And on that note, I think I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mike. Now, just a reminder that if you want to submit questions or you want to vote on questions already submitted, you can go to the web address on the screen and you can submit your questions there. You can vote for questions there. We'll also have opportunity to take some questions off the floor, but we have a few to begin with, Mike. First of all, are there examples around the globe where there are thriving or healthy examples of secularism? So, in your opinion?
Well, again, like I gave the example from the United Kingdom, even with an established church, I think they do have a healthy level of secularism. That means religious groups are not persecuted or not coerced, and all people are still able to participate in wider society. Now, if you compare that with somewhere like either China or Iran, you would argue that the UK, I think, is a pretty good model. I mean, generally, I think we have a fairly good model in Australia, but I think that's being put under strain largely by this sort of debate about, LGBT rights and religious freedom. That's the main thing, but it's also exposed that we do have a few gaps that need to be filled. We need either an anti-discrimination bill and possibly a positive statement on religious freedom based on the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So generally, I think we do it pretty well. But yeah, there's room for improvement and a few kind of cracks that could become problematic.
You've used the phrase tolerate quite a bit. Sometimes people interpret that as begrudgingly putting up with someone. What do you mean by tolerate? I suspect it's not that.
Yeah, no tolerance should be begrudging. No tolerance should be begrudging. All tolerance should be based on the idea that people have the right to be different, okay? And it's that idea, look, I may disagree with what you say, with your choice of action, your decision, but I recognise you have the right to do that. And I want you to have the right to do that, and I want to champion your right to do that, so in due time, one day you'll be the one who champions me when I'm in the minority. So, that's why I think we need this idea of tolerate, not begrudging, but if we're going to be a liberal democracy, and that word liberal means liberalities, it means freedom. If we're going to have those freedoms, then we're going to have to tolerate people who are different.
Christians can sometimes be nervous about secularism. How would you communicate that secularism is actually good news for expressing and exercising the Christian faith?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of my whole thing. So I kind of go on the road and talk about...
Open invitation. Yeah.
Open invitation, yeah. Well, I would say secularism is actually a Christian invention. You could argue it goes back to the 11th century, with the Catholic Church was trying to find a way to disentangle itself from civil powers. It kind of has its roots there. It comes out of the Catholic versus Protestant conflict, after the Reformation. Now, I mean, the idea of religious toleration, I mean, that's not new. The Mongols, for all of their incredible brutality, actually were very good at practicing religious toleration. But that was the mere toleration. We just don't care. As long as we're conquering and taxing everyone, we don't really care what you do for worship. In secularism, it's more than toleration. It's about a framework where there is participation and a framework where the government does not discriminate against people, and it wants to encourage the participation of all peoples in our own political framework and their own pursuit of happiness. So I would say secularism is an explicitly Christian invention, and the proof of that, I think, is the way that secularism at the moment is waning in places like Turkey and India. Turkey, for a long time, was a secular Muslim country, I think largely born out of its proximity to Europe and the interface of European ideas. But I would argue that Islam and Hinduism, I would say, are not really religions. They're more like different types of civilizations. Because for us, Christians, were able to disentangle, worship from identity and ethnography and belonging to the state. But in Islam and Hinduism, they're all a lot more closer combined. And that is why I think we are seeing the erosion of secularism in both Turkey and in India. Because the idea of having that religion is a thing that's separate from your politics, we might take that as self-evident, but it's not self-evident for most of history and in other parts of the world. I mean, if you're a public servant in Thailand, as part of your job, you can be required to do Buddhist rituals, like light incense things. I mean, it seems foreign to us, but in different parts of the world, that separation of church and state doesn't exist. And the reason we have that is because of the history of Christianity in the West and how it sought to engage in its own internal disputes, ruptures and fissures and its own entanglements with political power. But those same debates haven't happened within Islam and within Hinduism.
Now, just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question from the floor, we do have a couple of mics roaming as well. Not this mic is not roaming, but some microphones roaming. So if you do, just pop your hand and then one of the ushers will come over to you. But just whilst we wait to see if anyone from the floor does have a question. Another question from online. Christians sometimes seem a bit protective about their beliefs. How should they react to social hostility? How should they respond?
Well, I think that it depends on the level of hostility. Okay, like if someone just puts something nasty on social media, I think you need it. We do need to have a pretty thick skin. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm very concerned with what happened at Calvary Hospital because I think that sets a dangerous precedent. And if that's what this government does now, what does the next government do in 5 years, 10 years? And I'm worried that there'll be things like a government will just one day decide they're going to nationalise all Christian schools or something along those lines. So I think we need to have a response that's got to be proportional towards what we're facing. And I think that response has got to be leaning into this secular. We need to be champions of secularism. We cannot defend religious freedom without defending secularism. And I think that's what we've got to articulate to the political powers, and in some cases, if it comes down to it, advocated in the courts, and maybe one day be out there in the streets protesting if that's what it comes down to.
Do you think it can be dangerous when some Christians victimise themselves and have an outlook of being a minority?
Yeah, I mean, having a bit of a persecution complex when you're not really being persecuted, I don't think is a good look. Christians in Iran or in northern Nigeria or North Korea, I mean, that's persecution. Or I look and, I read stories about Christians in China. I mean, when you're being dragged away by the police in the middle of the night, that's when I think, we should really be worried. But we are nowhere near that because our liberal democratic institutions are thankfully thick, wholesome and robust, I believe, to prevent that. But what we can be alert to are some gradual incursions against religious freedom and against secularism. Let me give you one good example. In Victoria, they passed some gender identity, anti-gay conversion therapy laws and gender suppression. Now, the intention behind the laws was good. The idea you don't send gay teenagers to some sort of camp to be deprogrammed for their gayness, because we know that these things don't work, and in fact, they're very harmful to adolescents. So it's actually a bad idea to do this. Now, this was accepted and supported by the Anglicans, the Catholics, the Muslims, the Jewish organisation. We all agreed we don't want, conversion therapy for adolescents in, Victoria or anything like that. The problem was the government in Victoria defined gender suppression so incredibly broadly, so much so they explicitly prohibited certain types of prayer. Victoria is the only jurisdiction in the world that I know of that has literally criminalised certain types of prayer. I would say that's probably gone a bridge too far. And the other thing in Victoria, if you mention the word celibacy in the context of LGBTI people or relationships, you can also find yourself potentially in trouble with the law. And it hasn't been tested yet. We don't know how far it's going to be taken. So that's probably an example of how I think we may have some minor incursions into religious freedom. When you're criminalising certain types of prayer, something I think has gone wrong there. And if no one's allowed to say the word celibacy without getting into trouble, I think there's also going to be some problems there. But we have to see it tested in the courts to see what happens and whether they're going to accept a broad or narrow definition of suppression.
Under your recommendation, should there still be grounds when a government could tell religion what to do?
Yeah, and in fact, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights lays out the conditions in which government can do that. So let me give you an example. During the pandemic, I think it was appropriate for the government to determine that groups gathering together, such as churches, may have to wear masks. Or maybe there has to be a prohibition on meeting together in certain periods because there's a pandemic or some sort of great emergency and the like. I think it is legitimate for governments to do that. Now, there can be the danger that governments take that a little bit too far. One incident I know in Western Australia, where there was a church service going on in a Catholic church. A police officer entered the church, ordered the priest to cease the service, and he then went around checking everyone's vaccine passports. This happened in Western Australia. And if I was the priest in charge, I would have been, I love police officers. I really do love police officers. But I would have told the police officer that now is not the appropriate time to do that. And he should have done it before the service, or he can wait until after the service. Because I would regard that as needlessly intrusive on that situation. But in theory, I believe, government can do it, but they've got to have reasons to do it. There are limits to religious freedom, but there are also limits to the limits you can put on religious freedom. I could talk about the Syracuse principles and a whole bunch of other weird things, but I won't bore you with the details.
The federal government is asking for submissions on the Combating Misinformation Disinformation Bill 2023. Any suggestions to include in the submission? It's due on the 6th of the 8th. They mentioned that as well. So.
I've looked at this a little bit. I am a little bit concerned about what the government wants to do. It does have a kind of Big Brother, Ministry of Truth kind of a vibe to it. I understand the idea. You want to stop people spreading misinformation through Facebook, things like the vaccine's really got a chip in it to control your mind. I can understand why governments want to stop that kind of a thing, but we have to be very vigilant when it comes to defending freedom of speech. And what I tell people is whenever you knock down a fence, you've always got to ask yourself, why was the fence put up in the first place? So if there is a fence guarding, freedom of speech, why was that fence put up? Like if you knock down a fence and then you look at the fence on the ground and it says on it, warning, lion enclosure, knocking down the fence was probably a bad idea. And I am a little bit concerned about this disinformation bill. Well-intentioned as it may be, in the hands of nefarious actors, it could be used as a form of censorship or widening or eliminating one of the most important freedoms we have, and that is freedom of speech.
What is your position on Christians speaking into the public domain about matters of religious freedom? So should we be communicating with political reps?
Yes, definitely. My advice is read any legislation that comes out on religious freedom or, freedom of speech or anything like that. You can also follow a number of very good groups that are kind of very good at explaining what is going on. Groups like the Institute for Civil Society, Freedom for Faith. This is where they've got a bunch of really clever Christian lawyers who still have their consciences and everything. And they know how to read legislation and they can help explain it to you. And usually in a fairly sensible and simple way, explain what is going on and what's at stake. And then write to your local members and tell them your concerns. Make submissions to various parliament inquiries, various commissions. And the more active you are, the more our political representatives will take notice, because our political representatives are very big on getting re-elected. And when they see what the mind or the vibe of their own constituents are, normally they do have to listen. So yeah, you should definitely get informed and be activist on this topic.
How do we, as individuals, help Australia progress towards a confident secularism?
Yeah, I think the number one thing we have to break down are the caricatures of secularism, and that's amongst both Christians and non-Christians. I have people saying to me, why are you going around spreading your religious ideas? Don't you know Australia's a secular country? And I say, well, no, Australia's not a secular country. It is a multicultural country with a secular government. I believe in the secularity of government, but Australia is a land of all faiths and none. And what helps us to be that, to be a very successful multicultural country, what helps us to be a very good, robust, liberal democracy is that we have a healthy account of secularism. That secularism helps us to be a tolerant, inclusive, participationist society. And if that secularity is compromised either into theocracy or into a more militant brand of secularism, then our political freedoms and our social cohesion are both going to suffer as a result.
Churches often campaigned against the religious freedom referendum in 1988. Was that a mistake? And can we learn from that in pursuing of religious freedom today?
Yeah, my memory of 1988 is a little bit limited on the grounds that I was 14. And believe it or not, but constitutional law was not my primary interest back then. I was interested in other things like Ninja Turtles. That's what I was interested in when I was 14. Now, from what I have understood, the referendum failed because the people thought it was a power grab by the federal government in the area of religion. But I would say now, I think the Hawke government did this with great prescience, trying to fill in a gap in our constitutional law between Commonwealth and state governments. And should it ever come up again in a referendum, I think we should definitely support an expansion of it, so the same limitations placed upon the Commonwealth government about establishing or restricting religion are also applied to the state governments and territories.
If someone hears this and thinks there is a lot of historical and legal and cultural complexity to this, what would be a really simple way, what would be an easy step to begin unpicking that in your own mind? Obviously your book will be really helpful, Mike.
Well, obviously.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But what do you think could be some simple steps? Because I think it can be so overwhelming almost in its complexity that people can not know really where to begin.
Yeah. Oh, and that's how it was for me. I thought, yeah, we have religious freedom. I read the Constitution. I said, they say the Commonwealth government, and some said, Commonwealth government, not the state government. And then I looked at the Bill of Rights in Victoria, which was, okay, you got that, but then there's all these different exemptions to discrimination law in all the different states. It's all a hodgepodge of inconsistency. And then I read about the history of secularism in Christendom, and like I said, I went down the rabbit hole on that one. I thought this would be a nice 5,000 word essay, and 8 years later I'm still down there. I mean, as my wife can tell you, I've got a big stack of books on religious freedom in about America, the UK, Australia, and all the sorts of things. So I'm still getting grips with this all the time, and as this space continues. But if I wanted to sum up what we should be advocating, it's that Bible verse that George Washington quoted: "Everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and none shall make them afraid." I think that's basically what we want to aim for. The history, the legal stuff, the politics, all of that has to be instrumental to live in a society where we don't go around chopping each other's heads off because of our religious affiliation or our lack of religious affiliation. So that's, I think, is the name of the game. Australia is the country where we pride ourselves on being a fair go for everyone. And I think secularism, religious freedom are very instrumental to being a country of the fair go.
Under a secular framework, how can evangelism flourish, so the sharing of faith,
Yep.
And won't everyone just say that no one can seek to proselytise, to evangelise, to share what they believe?
No, I mean, the freedom of religion includes the freedom to practice and promote their religion. So I think religious freedom explicitly requires the freedom to, practice and propagate religion. And I mean, people might say, well, I find what you're doing offensive. Your evangelism offensive. And when people say that, I always quote to them what Salman Rushdie said. Salman Rushdie, the famous Indian author who's wrote some book that upset like every Muslim in the world. He said, nobody has the right not to be offended. And I think that's the right. No one has the right to harm other people, but I don't believe anyone has the right not to be offended because it's such a subjective category, things that are offensive. I find coffee offensive, Adam, but no one's going to... I mean, it's like, I don't know, it's like sewage from the depths of hell. But no one in their right mind is going to let me ban it. I find the taste and the smell wholly, entirely offensive. But I should not be entitled the right to ban it outright on penalty of death. So
in fact, I think I hear you saying you're going to argue for the right of it continuing and being able to be offered up wherever you go, I think is what you'll be arguing for, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah, that's where I may have some begrudging tolerance.
That's right.
But I just can't stand coffee.
How do we deal with arguments based on emotion? Now, that could be at all sorts of positions, actually, in approach to this. But I might actually add a little tweak to that question. So for those people who are Christians, who identify with the Christian faith, how do you think they should deal when confronted with emotional or even aggressive argument?
Yeah. Okay, one thing you've got to remember, nobody changes their mind by being yelled at and verbally abused. I mean, sociologists have proved this. No one changes their mind by real rancorous, almost self-righteous tirades. Okay, no one changes their mind. Where people change their mind is when you raise a question in their mind, okay, or you sow seeds of doubt. So when I get confronted with somebody who says, well, Australia is a secular country, I say, well, which type of secularism do you advocate? French laïcité? The Turkish version? The American version, which is very much driven by locality? The secularism of Dallas is very different to the secularity of Boston. Which version of secularism do you advocate? Simply asking a question like that, they go, oh, I did not know there was kind of different versions. I say, well, explain to me your version of secularism. Well, I don't think that religious people should be sticking their nose in politics. I say, you mean religious people like Martin Luther King? Should he have been sticking his nose in politics? I mean, if the Reverend Martin Luther King was running for office, would you have voted for him? Because he had a very explicitly religious message. So did Malcolm X, who was a Muslim civil rights activist. Would you shut them? When you raise these sorts of questions, it does challenge people and it makes them think that maybe their version of secularism needs to come closer to yours.
So, Mike, you're obviously, I think it's fair to say, a follower of Jesus.
Very keen.
Very keen. And this is linked to one of the questions that has been asked. As a follower of Jesus, how does he set an example for you in how to engage in gracious conversations, particularly around social or really hot topics of difference?
Yeah, I mean, Jesus taught love of God and love of neighbour. We love God with our heart, mind, soul and strength, and we love our neighbour as ourselves. If you're going to love your neighbour, you have to love your neighbour as they are, and you have to allow them to be who they are. You need to allow them to be other, to be different than you. Because the minute you try to coerce your neighbour to make them more like you, then you could argue that you're not loving your neighbour. Now, again, it can be a little bit complicated. If my neighbour believes he or she's entitled to murder people, you can't do that because they're not loving their neighbour. But I think if we make the teaching of Jesus central, love of God, love of neighbour, programmatic, not just for our personal ethics, but also for our public ethics, I think we'll have a very powerful testimony in public. I mean, That's why I think Martin Luther King was so powerful. He took a message that was very biblical, born of the 8th century prophets, of the teaching of Jesus, the Apostle Paul, and he brought it to the attention of the American people. So you claim you're Christian, and yet you not only turn a blind eye to these injustices, you manufacture these horrors for fellow men and women who are in the image of God, who are meant to be brothers and sisters in Christ. And that was powerful. It was powerful then, and I think a similar message for our own 21st century context, even laced in religious language of the Bible, I think would continue to be powerful today.
Mike, you have been so generous with us tonight, thank you. And I really want to encourage, for those who are in person, you can continue the conversation, probably over hot chocolate or tea.
But not coffee.
But please feel free to continue the conversation with Mike. And you might also have some follow-up things you want to post online, and we're happy to share those as well, and we're going to share out some resources. But would you like to put your hands together and thank Mike?
Thank you very much.
Well, once again, thank you so much for joining us with us tonight. I really want to encourage you, invite you, that if you would love to continue conversation, you have questions about all sorts of things, well, we'd love to be part of that genuinely. And so a simple way to get that going is just by completing a Next Steps card. So you can do that online, you can collect them in the foyer if you like, and you might just want to say, I'd love to have a conversation with someone about whatever topic you would like to. So I'd really encourage you to do that. You might also have some questions about the Christian faith, and perhaps coming here tonight, it's raising questions for you, or watching online, you think, well, actually, there's things I don't know, or there might be things that I have misunderstood, or there's really quite arguments that I have. If that is you, I really want to invite you into conversation. A really safe way to do that, a safe space, is something called Alpha. And we have our next Alpha course starting on October 9, and it runs in person and online. And it is such a great way to ask questions, to hear questions of others, and really explore the most significant matters of life. And so I've got a little video to share with you now, just a little bit about what Alpha is all about.
Everyone is searching for answers to life's big questions. Is there more to life than this? Why am I here? Who is Jesus? At Alpha, you can ask anything around a table with people just like you who have questions about life, faith, and meaning. There's a seat for you at the table. Find your nearest Alpha today.
Well, you don't have to search very far to find the nearest Alpha to you, because there's one right here, or you can join online. So that's October 9th. So if that's of interest to you, you can just register on our website, or after our time, you can just really have a chat to someone at the Next Steps wall in the foyer, or you can just mention in the chat, if you're joining us online, that you'd love to chat with someone about Alpha, and they'd only be too happy to help. I'd also love to invite you along to St. Bart's on a Sunday. At the moment, we are exploring a series on being human, and so we're spending 9 weeks actually looking at what is human all about? What does it mean? How do we understand ourselves and understand one another? And so we're spending 9 weeks considering that, and Mike's going to be with us on Sunday at 7:30 and 9:30 and 6 p.m. We have 3 services on a Sunday. You can join us in person at all those 3, or online for the morning services. But he's going to be helping us explore that part of being human is actually being rational, that we have minds and cognition. And so what is that all about? How is that good? How is it a bit broken? And how do we understand more through the lens of the Bible? So if that's of interest to you, please do join us on Sunday. You'd be so welcome. If you'd love to explore more about Jesus and power, tomorrow we're having a teaching day. We'll have 3 in-depth lectures on that topic. There's tickets available for purchase tonight. Afterwards, you can go see someone in the foyer. They'll be very happy to help you out with that. but I really encourage you, please do stay afterwards. We have tea and coffee and hot chocolate in the foyer. It's so wonderful to continue the conversation. And as I mentioned, if you've got some more questions for Mike, but didn't get through all the questions, tonight, then you'd be really welcome to have a chat with him as well. Just to be finished, I'd love to just offer a really simple prayer. Gracious God, we thank you so much for your generosity to us. We thank you that we can meet here this night, that we can meet in person and online. Lord, we thank you for the extraordinary privileges that we enjoy in Australia and the extraordinary freedom that we enjoy in Australia. Lord, please help us to lovingly and graciously speak into these topics and spaces that we might really flourish as a nation for all people of faith and also of none. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much for joining us, and please feel free to stay afterwards as well. We have a bookstall and a library, and on the bookstall you can purchase copies of Mike's books, including his book on religious freedom. So you might like to check those out, but there's a whole range of helpful titles. So please do stay, join us, peruse the bookstall, and enjoy some hot drinks.